In Death Battle, only 2 franchises have ever been in every single season. Of course, those are Marvel and DC, the 2 big comic companies who've been rivals for over half a century. Not only are these the 2 most used franchises on Death Battle, but they both have the most combatants on Death Battle, 32 for DC and 40 for Marvel, and Marvel vs DC making up 28 episodes, or roughly 15% of all episodes of the show. So, is this a problem? You'll see a lot of people nowadays talking about cape shit brain rot, and while most of the people will be talking about the films, the MCU and the DCEU and the like, this terminology and thought process has extended out from that and into the Versus community as well. It seems with each passing Marvel vs DC episode, more and more people are tuning out and showing a lack of interest. But what's the issue here? I'm not here today to talk about the issues with Death Battle using Marvel and DC so much and my problems with it, but rather talking about the group of people who aren't as enthusiastic whenever these episodes are announced, why they may think this way, and why it's so weird to me that people like to beat each other's throats sometimes over this rivalry. Casual cape shit enjoyers and average cape shit unenthusiasts seems to be almost as big a rivalry as Marvel vs DC itself sometimes. So why do I think people are generally getting tired of cape shit episodes? Well, there's many reasons, but the big one is this: a lack of interest. This is something you'll actually see a lot about Death Battle in general. What it really comes down to is most of the people who do not show much interest in Marvel vs DC episodes are just people who do not have much of an interest in Marvel vs DC themselves. They might enjoy the films or shows, but those aren't really the characters being analysed. No matter how much someone likes MCU Iron Man, Star-Lord or Thor, those characters have never been and will never be on Death Battle. Maybe, I don't know. But rather, their different, stronger, and alternate traditional comic incarnations would be on Death Battle. Why'd I use Star-Lord? He's not been on Death Battle yet. Usually people who don't want more Marvel and DC episodes will not be the people who love the comics, but the people who don't care or even actively dislike them. And what gets to me is, why do so many people have to make a fuss about that? Why do people do stuff like go out of their way to start arguments about whether Death Battle uses too much Marvel or DC, just because of the response those episodes' announcements tend to get? And you might be wondering, well, why don't people have this same opinion towards other series that are not Marvel or DC? They do. The mindset of not being interested in an episode or matchup because you lack interest in the series is by no means exclusive to Marvel and DC. And honestly, in my opinion, it's not a problem or an issue. It is completely normal to not have investment in something that you don't have any interest in. Now, when I say that, I don't want to make it seem like the people who don't like Marvel and DC are just like one group and not like multiple. There are of course those who actively hate any Marvel vs DC episode on principle, thinking they have some manner of moral high ground. But I hope that you can just trust I'm referring to the majority and not those extremes in this video. I'd go as far as to say though that not only is it normal that people wouldn't have interest and shouldn't force themselves to have interest in something that they, well, lack interest in, but even if they were to, I don't know, skip the episode or even rate the episode lower because they weren't invested, that's not a bad thing in the slightest. It's honestly normal, and for the same reason that plenty of people's favourite episodes of Death Battle will be because of personal investment in the characters or matchup. Rarely will you find someone whose favourite is decided entirely off the quality of the episode and does not involve their personal enjoyment of the franchise or characters. Even Biffweed, who was one of those cases, ended up having his favourite episode dethroned by one that involved his favourite character of all time, and it'd be pretty wild to assume that this was a completely objective choice that just entirely ignored the fact that he likes Saitama so much. And plenty of other series get hit with the people not being interested thing, the most notable recent example being a certain scientific railgun, with ignorant people claiming that the then best-selling light novel franchise of all time and today's second best-selling was one of the most obscure series that Death Battle's ever used. As such, plenty of people went out of their way to not watch Killua vs Misaka or dunk on the episode for using a character they had no interest in. And this wasn't necessarily a small amount of people either. Plenty of people went out of their way to make this opinion clear and have a big whinge about it. And that's fine. I mean, there was a large group mocking Death Battle and Toaru fans, and that wasn't fine. But people who just weren't invested, that's totally okay. It's not an issue exclusive to Marvel and DC. So why does it get brought up so much more often than other franchises who get the same treatment? I mean, there's 2 simple reasons. Reason 1, abundance! The obvious one, the sheer amount of Marvel DC Death Battles that already exist and keep getting made is a big reason why it gets brought up so much. At least 2 or 3 times or whatever a season, this issue will get brought into the spotlight because there's simply so many of them that get made. People like to make a fuss over how much people complain about Marvel and DC, but that's just because there's so many of them. And I know it might seem like I'm saying that the problem is that Death Battle makes too many of them. Sure, whatever. What I'm saying is that the issue is brought up so much because it gets made so often. I'm sure if Toaru came back, there'd be plenty of people who feel the exact same way as they did the first time. Or maybe less, because 90% likelihood it'll be Accelerator, and tons of people want him versus Magneto, despite probably not even knowing what book he's from. Anyway, is it really any shock that people talk about their disinterest in Marvel and DC more when it's more often used? Why in the world do people have to make such a fuss and act as if the people who simply lack interest in the series are doing something wrong or talking about it too much, when the only reason they talk about it when they do is often because they're either asked about it or because it's being brought in the spotlight as 2 weeks at a time. It's the whole thing everyone's talking about. People aren't going to suddenly stop saying it just because they said it a few times over the course of the last year. People still want to be part of the conversation and talk with the community, and inevitably, that's going to lead to eventually at worst being asked what their opinion is, telling their opinion, and then often being treated like they're doing something wrong because of it. And the other reason it's brought up so much is reason 2, burnout! People are burnt out, man. A big reason that a large group show disinterest in Marvel and DC on Death Battle is just this. We've gotten it so much that people who weren't interested but at least excited to learn once don't care anymore. That's the thing, with new franchises that people don't have pre-existing investment in, there is at least a large group who will still be excited because they want to learn about the series. People will go out of their way to watch their source material if they're not familiar just so they can get invested. But that's not something that happens with Marvel and DC comics because we've just gotten so many of them. The people who were interested and wanted to jump into it probably already have by now, and the people who didn't intend to jump into the comics just won't randomly start doing it now. At least if you don't know anything about something like Toaru or Black Clover from last season, you can just watch the anime adaptation and more or less it'll be a direct adaptation of the source material. You can't really do this with Marvel and DC. The MCU or the animated series, those are completely separate characters to what Death Battle will be tackling, and can sometimes have entirely different origins or power sets. With Marvel and DC, you have to go read the comics, and people don't want to do that. Most of the time, people have jobs or school responsibilities that make it so the only time they have to engage with media is when they're tired and just want to relax. And it's understandable that these people would rather be able to digest something that you can just flick on a device and experience through watching, instead of having to read something. Especially because reading on a digital device, which is how most people would be reading, kind of sucks and it's unfun and I don't like it. Give me a real fucking book any day. And if you're wondering why people would be more willing to jump into a manga or a non-Marvel DC comic over Marvel and DC, it's because of the amount there is. Most comics do not run on for that long. They can be digested over a shorter span, with the exception of something like, I don't know, One Piece. People love learning about new series they don't have pre-existing investment in, but Marvel and DC is not a new series anymore. People are tired. Sure, there are tons of stories out there for these characters. They may differ in tone or vibe, and end up being in a situation where they might as well be entirely different experiences to what a reader may have already experienced. But that's kind of another thing. If there was a manga, let's say Berserk, that you've not read and then Guts gets on Death Battle and you decide to read it, you have the peace of mind knowing that anything in that manga has a chance of getting brought up. However, if you read 1 or 2 or 3 stories for a random Marvel or DC character, there's a decent chance those stories just might not get mentioned at all in the episode because they're just small, unimportant pieces. Unimportant? That's not a word. They're just small, unimportant pieces in that comic character's wider history, which can get discouraging because people do like seeing storylines and character arcs that they experienced and connected with getting addressed in episodes of Death Battle. The biggest argument I've seen against the whole overusage burnout thing from people who try to convince others that their opinion is objectively wrong is, well, there's so many different characters and power sets in Marvel and DC. But that's not really applicable here. It's still the same series. People who don't care about Marvel or DC comics aren't going to suddenly care because one character's power set or storyline are different to another's. And usually they're going to end up crossing over with other characters that they're tired of seeing anyway. You almost never get cases like Lucifer Morningstar where they're so removed from the wider sphere that you'll basically never see any other characters from the franchise show up in their stories. It's completely reasonable that a character having a different function to the others used in the same series wouldn't get people excited for a franchise they don't have any interest in. And if we really look at all the Marvel and DC characters used over the course of, say, the last 3 seasons, they might not necessarily be as unique and crazy as you might think. We've had 20 Marvel and DC characters from Season 7 to now. Probably 1 or 2 more will be announced by the time this video is out. Of them, 6 are returning characters: Lex Luthor, Doctor Doom, Batman, Iron Man, Thor, and Raven. 1 is an alternate version of a returner, Super Friends Aquaman, and of what remains, Eobard Thawne is very similar in power set to Barry Allen and Wally West from previous episodes, Black Adam is very similar to Shazam in power set, Harley Quinn has plenty of crossover with Joker, Scarlet Witch and Zatanna's limitless pool of abilities is fairly often compared to Doctor Strange and Doctor Fate, which I think is fairly reasonable. And Phoenix, while technically not having much crossover with existing characters, ends up just being a normal flying brick with flame powers in her episode, which honestly makes her in portrayal not too different to like Captain Marvel or something. That leaves us with really just 7 characters: Iron Fist, Storm, Magneto, Apocalypse, Ant-Man, Atom, and Rocket Raccoon. 2 of which fought each other, and 3 of which are X-Men characters. There absolutely are plenty of wacky and out there Marvel and DC characters, but lots of the popular ones and choices end up having tons of crossover with ones we've already had, like Kryptonians, Gamma Beasts, Lanterns, Speedsters, Asgardians. People act like the wide variety of power sets that exist in Marvel and DC's characters make anyone who is tired of learning about the same series they have no investment in, through characters they have no investment in, completely invalid in their opinion. Like, it's fine, it is completely fine to think it's okay because there's so many different power sets in Marvel and DC. It's not okay to think that someone being tired of seeing characters in this series are wrong to think that just because there are others that also exist. It's so weird to me that they think a lack of interest in the world and characters would be changed through something as simple as a power set switch up. Artoria and Gilgamesh in Fate, Zabuza and Deidara in Naruto, Anguirus and Void Ghidorah in Godzilla, or Q and Captain Kirk in Star Trek are all pairs of characters from the same series that have completely different and unrelated power sets and arsenals that are entirely distinct from one another. But if someone doesn't care about either character or the franchise and doesn't have any interest in learning, telling them, no, your opinion doesn't matter because Anguirus might have a spiky carapace, but Void Ghidorah has all these powers he doesn't, isn't going to change that. Why do people think that's an argument at all? And the thing is, people need to stop acting like this is exclusive to Marvel and DC either. People are starting to feel the same way about Dragon Ball. People who aren't already invested in the series aren't going to be motivated to start it if they haven't already by now. And people who don't like it or just don't care about it aren't going to start being excited to learn about the way this character scales to the same feat and has the same abilities plus a few embellishments. You can even sometimes see this as well to like Naruto, just on a much smaller scale, and even Star Wars, with lots of people clamoring for another non-Force user episode again, because of how different and new that'd be instead of just explaining lightsabers and the Force again. And when I lay it out like this, it's really simple, and people probably should have come to realize that, and not have to continually ask all the time why things are the way they are. People will continue to talk about their lack of interest in Marvel and DC on Death Battle, because Death Battle will continue to use Marvel and DC, and thus they will continue to be a topic of conversation. And people will continue to lack interest in Marvel and DC because they just don't have interest and have not wanted to or have tried and couldn't get into the comics. It's completely okay to love Marvel and DC and be excited for the next matchup between the two on Death Battle, but it's also completely okay to be on the other side as long as whichever side you're on, you're not obnoxious about it. And we shouldn't pretend like being on the side of generally not caring means they automatically write off the episodes or will just always not care. Take old Biffles Wiedenson for example. You're probably well aware of his character arc from, "Oh god, another Marvel vs DC, this upsets me so much, I don't want that," to, "Oh okay, another Marvel vs DC, that gives me a free Fortnite to not care and go make another Mario Kart ranking instead." No, that's my best shore crab impression. That's a Welsh crab. But instances like Rocket Raccoon show that if there was a matchup announced where he had a pre-existing interest in one or both characters, he would have some manner of investment. It's not that he automatically writes off Marvel and DC for being Marvel and DC, it's just that he doesn't care about the ones that he doesn't care about. It's really that simple. People don't need to go doing fucking calculus to figure this out, I'd hope. He'd be interested in characters he's interested in, and not in the ones he's not interested in. It just so happens that Death Battle have used most of the ones he has any interest in, and that he would have more interest in getting to learn about new series or more about series he doesn't know about. He might not have investment in, say, Misaka, but that was a new series that he'd not really known anything about, and he was excited to learn about it. He can't really be excited to learn about another Marvel DC character because it's just the same series, and sure, even if it is something completely different and new, that doesn't stop it from being another part of the same series. And a thing that's great about Death Battle is learning about new series. You can learn about the themes of Dark Souls, the lore of Elder Scrolls, the mathematic-based power system of Toaru, the mysteries of Gravity Falls, and so on just from this season alone. And plenty of people will be more interested in that than learning what this one character from this one group within this franchise they've already heard about 30 plus times can do in their niche. With that said, there's one thing I've seen floating around as well. A third reason that's very much more so just a thing for those really into the versus debating scene. Reason 3! The power creep? Yeah, the power creep. What do I mean by this? Well, let's look at this. If we took what the community, and to an extent myself, consider the strongest few characters have appeared in each season, you get this. And you'll notice, it's basically all Marvel and DC. Sure, some non-Marvel and DCs get mentioned as contenders for a high ranking, if not the top few. Season 1 has Spawn, and sometimes Kratos or Doomslayer brought up. Season 2 has He-Man, Godzilla, Soul Bad Guy, and War Greymon. Season 3 has Dante and Bayonetta. Season 4 has Virgil. Season 5 has Optimus Prime. Season 6 has Dracula. Season 7 has Broly. Season 8 has Popeye. Season 9 has Xeno, Trunks, and Archie Silver. And Season 10 so far has Bill Cipher, Discord, and The Last Dragonborn. And I'm not here to start arguments over whether these are all accurate, but these are what the Versus community generally consider up there from what I've observed. And if we were to swap this around so that people don't focus exclusively on this for the video instead of the actual point, and just look at which characters were placed the highest in each season they were in, we get this instead. As you can see, with the frankly fucking hilarious exception of Bowser and the slightly less hilarious exception of Sephiroth, every single one of these is from Marvel or DC, with the only times we have had a tie being when Death Battle has evened things out. And the smallest one of these we've had since Season 5 is 10 times above universe level, which is still really fucking strong. As a result, people are getting less and less impressed by the big numbers and insane stats as time has gone on. If we did another chart of how many characters were universal or had universal tech or above per season, we get this. This is not a You'll chart. See that the numbers have only been going up, with Season 10 so far having only 6, but also, we're less than halfway through, and let's be honest, Bill and Discord are absolutely going to be put at Universal anyway, so this number may as well be 8, but I'm not going to place all my bets on that necessarily just yet. And sure, not all of these characters are from Marvel and DC, but a majority of them are. More than 50%, oh shit, an actual chart this time. More than 50% are from Marvel or DC. Now, is this a problem? Not to some, but yes to others, and I think it's totally okay to be on either side. The side that doesn't like this and the side that does, because it can end up lowering the impact when characters get super high stats these days. As an example, I'm a big fan of Shin Megami Tensei 3, and I've always been interested in Elder Scrolls. As such, the Nerevarra versus the Demi-Fiend is a matchup that I describe as sick as fuck. One of the most notable things about these two is just how absurdly powerful they are. They're less characters as much as they are figures. Figures of such a grand mythological scale and power as to be incomprehensible to mortal man. The Nerevarine was able to achieve Chim or Kim or Kime, I don't know how it's said and nowhere I go is it inconsistent, but a state in which one is free from oblivion and its flaws. From what I've read, many consider this act from him as enough to constitute ranking them as one of the strongest individuals in the entirety of the Elder Scrolls franchise. Likewise, the Demi-Fiend has the frankly absurd feat of directly tanking the complete obliteration of an infinite set of universes happening directly in his face when the Amala Labyrinth went up around him and he was unharmed. He fell over. That's the most reaction he had. With lore in mind, one could easily argue both of these two as so cosmically powerful and beyond our concepts of dimensions and existence as to reach a power where the infinite multiverse itself would be imperceivably minuscule next to their sheer might. In other words, a tier below whatever random ass fucking Marvel vs DC cosmic episode happens to come out around it. Yes, I'm aware that you can argue Nerevarine and Demi-Fiend is high enough to be on par at least, but the point is that no matter how strong they may be, Death Battle will almost certainly plateau at best around the same as whatever cosmic Marvel vs DC episode happens around it. The impact of these simply biblical pun intended power levels possessed by these two is greatly lessened in the context of, at best, them equaling 4, maybe more characters who've already been on the show. And like, you do have to consider how long ago those characters were, of course. Those characters at that level of power were this season and the season before that. It doesn't make learning about the lore that leads to these power levels less interesting, as the peak of their power is rooted in the extremely interesting, intricate, and intriguing internal indexes of their intellectual properties. But the final oomph of the moment is lost because Marvel and DC already made Death Battle hit their peak of power, and likely there will be more episodes between the two that continue hitting that level. This doesn't make me want the episode any less though. Nerevarine vs Demi-Fiend is still fucking sick. People who love to see big numbers and huge power levels and scaling are going to get their chubbies still. But people who are less invested in actively seeking those huge power levels are going to be in a situation where instead of going, holy shit, these guys are absolutely busted, they're going to go, oh, okay, another two that are this strong. And yes, I know that this issue might have begun in episode 50 with Infinite Power Superman, but the thing is that it took all the way until season 5 with Dr. Fate for us to get another character on that level of power. And since Dr. Fate, 3 of the seasons after have had at least 2 combatants reach or surpass infinity. One season where they reach a level that's not infinity but so high as to lose any meaning, and only season 6 after Dr. Fate's introduction has not reached those heights or more again. Cosmic fights simply have stopped being so impactful due to the proliferation of them. When every season has 2 or 3 of them and it's almost always Marvel vs DC, it's just tiring in many ways. Hell, this season we got the epic Dragonborn, scaled to so strong as to kill a dragon who is infinitely infinite, thus making him so powerful that he was still inferior to the former Caphiliac wife-beater from the episode directly prior to him. Big shocker, that was a Marvel character. All that said, there's one more thing that I think might have played into this. That's me and Season 7. And my fellow Versus content creators. Specifically, while there's definitely multiple groups, most of the big Death Battle content creators fall into the category of either people who aren't huge Marvel and DC heads like me, Biff, Galactic Attorney and whatnot, and people who are huge Marvel and DC heads, but have an active bone to pick with Death Battle, like... What, you think I'm stupid enough to put a target on my back naming names? Get out of here. And I'm not blaming anyone for this, because to shoot blame would be to assume that anyone is at fault for being honest about our opinions. And when some of the bigger names in the community, like myself and the old Bister with his almanac of the best Sans vs. Freddy episodes he's watched from across the multiverse, go out of our way to discuss how we're less than hyped and also disinterested with whatever is coming next, it leads to both the false impression that the majority of people feel the same way, and the less than desirable situation where a group of younglings will parrot our opinions, thinking it'll get them into our good graces if they form their opinions based on ours. To be clear, while I can't speak for Biff on this, I can say that I'd probably be able to slap together a list of 20 Marvel vs. DC episodes that, if announced, I'd at least be somewhat excited for. Bam! There you go. These are in no particular order. Fuck, I hope I managed to find 20. It's just that the ones that Death Battle have done have not been ones I've been too hyped about. Though with this season, currently, the only 2 they've done are episodes that I've been excited for at least to small extents. And yeah, in my top 20, some of these are indeed cosmic, but the reason I'd be excited for any of them is either that I really like the characters, or that it's so wacky and unusual that I think it'd be fun. Or in the case of Godspeed vs. Danny Ketch and Alan Scott vs. Jim Hammond, because I came up with the matchups and I seek validation for that. And you know, there's Marvel vs. non-DCs I love, like Beta Ray Bill vs. Enkidu, or DC vs. non-Marvels like John Constantine vs. the Doctor. What was the point of this video again? I don't know, I wanted to air my thoughts on all this. People really like to have a go at people who are tired of or dislike the overabundance of Marvel vs. DC episodes. And while some of them can be obnoxious and should be ridiculed on the internet, as is the right of all sentient beings, plenty of them are just expressing an opinion that they have the right to express. And the only reason it seems like discourse is because it happens so often, which is not their fault, and the only ways they have to avoid bringing it up is to actively disengage from a community in which many of their friends and people they talk to may be. And that's something that they shouldn't have to do because another group gets pissy over their opinion, because they think they're wrong or they don't like how often it happens. Again, this discourse only happens so often because the episodes happen so often. Who's at fault there? Frankly, nobody, except the people who actively seek to turn these into arguments. This weird thing I've seen where everyone gets overly defensive against people who express a lack of interest in Marvel vs. DC episode and thus they feel the need to go after them needs to stop. This video is not going to stop that. It is not the fault of the people who lack interest. They can't force themselves to be interested, they can't avoid bringing it up without disengaging for your sake, which they shouldn't have to do, and people shouldn't act like they need to defend their honor and their right to have an opinion by throwing reasons that don't have any meaning to them in an attempt to prove the other side wrong. Both sides are in the right to feel the way they do about these episodes, these matchups, how often they happen, whether it's too much or not, and are allowed to be excited or not when they're announced, as long as either side is not getting shitty over it. And let's be clear, the side that's not interested in Marvel and DC also has bad apples in them, but lately I've seen most of them silenced, and it's just the bad apples on the support side who keep going after the ones who just have lack of interest that I see now. Most of the ones I've seen simply express their lack of interest lately, and then that's the end of story, end up being forced into arguments over why they think this way, and have people try to explain to them why they're wrong for reasons that just don't apply. People tend to give me and Biff and others like us the respect of, that's their opinion, even if I disagree. And I thank everyone who is able to have that opinion towards me and Biff, and respect our opinions even if you do disagree. But I think that respect should go to people who don't have large platforms like us as well. Nobody wants to argue back and forth on their opinions that cannot be changed, because the arguments given simply are not applicable to the opposing side. So stop wasting your breath, stop starting arguments. Both sides, stop starting arguments, because it's completely justifiable why you feel the way you do no matter what. You don't need yourself to get verified, you don't need to unverify the other side. You're both in the right, it's just a difference in opinion. Now that that's said and done, I wonder how long it'll be before the next Marvel vs. DC episode is announced.